So this whole quiz is going to be on functions, f of x, g of x, h of x. As a matter of fact, let's begin by copying down these three functions. I apologize for that gray color on h of x. You could barely see that. But we have three functions. One of them's named f of x, the other one's g of x, and the other one's h of x. F of x is in red, it's x minus 2. G of x is in blue, it's 2x plus 3. H of x is gray, which is simply x squared. And we're going to use these three different functions to answer the following, okay? So we first need to begin by understanding the notation f minus g of x. What does that really mean? That we're going to take the f of x function and subtract it with, actually I'm going to do the subtraction with black, subtract it with the g of x function, which is in blue. So what is the f of x function? The f of x function is x minus 2. So I could put it in parentheses, put that x minus 2 right there in parentheses, have that black minus sign right there, and put the g of x function also in parentheses, 2x plus 3. Now, which parenthesis is not necessary? The red one or the blue one? Red one's not necessary because there's nothing to distribute out here, right? This blue one is necessary to remind you that you need to distribute that minus sign to both. So that first one, you don't even have to write the parentheses. You could just rewrite it x minus 2. And when you take this black subtraction symbol and you distribute it to both, you're going to end up with negative 2x minus 3. And then after that, simply combining like terms. You combine the variable x with the variable negative 2x, and that will be a negative 1x, or just negative x. And then you have the minus 2 that you're going to combine with the minus 3, and we will get minus 5. And we are done. The answer is negative x minus 5. That's your answer to that first one. So it's going to be one of those. Very simple. It's just combining like terms after you distribute the minus sign. Let's take a look at this next one. This next one, we're going to be using the f of x function, the red one, and the h of x function, the gray one. And we need to add those together. So let's write the f of x function and add it with the h of x function. So the f of x function is x minus 2. We don't really need parentheses around that. There's nothing to distribute it in. And as a matter of fact, you don't even need the parentheses on the gray one, because if you distribute a plus sign, it doesn't make a difference. If you want, you could just plug it in with parentheses and then later on ignore the parentheses. But anyway, the h of x function really is x squared. And like I said, if this were a minus, yeah, you distribute it, it'd become a negative x squared, but it's a plus, so you don't even need the parentheses really. So what do we have? We really just have x minus 2 plus x squared, and that's out of order. You want your trinomial to be in standard form from highest exponent down to smallest. So your correct final answer would be x squared plus x minus 2. So this is really x squared plus x minus 2. Any questions on those two? I hope we got that. There's going to be a couple of those on the quiz tomorrow. Of course, there's more than just adding and subtracting. There's also multiplying and dividing. Okay, so we're using the same three functions throughout this practice quiz that we're doing right here, this study session for the quiz. We're using the same three functions, f of x in red, g of x in blue, h of x in gray. So right here, they want us to multiply the f of x function with the g of x function. So the f of x, which is in red, we need to multiply it by the g of x function, which is in blue. So right here, definitely would be a good idea to plug it in to parentheses. So the f of x function is really the x minus 2, and the g of x function is really the 2x plus 3. So how do we do this? You simply distribute x times 2x, that's 2x squared, x times 3, that's 3x, positive 3x. When you combine this negative 2 times 2x, that's a negative 4x. Negative 2 times positive 3 is negative 6. And of course, the middle terms could be combined. They are like terms. So what we have here is 2x squared minus 1x minus 6. So that's the answer to that original question, f dot g of x, f times g of x. So number 4, the notation f divided by g of x, that's saying the f of x function, which is in red, divided by the g of x function, which is in blue. So you just write it out. The f of x function is x minus 2 over the g of x function, which is 2x plus 3. Is there anything to cancel? I hope everybody says no. Right? There's nothing to cancel because there's addition or subtraction. Right? Even if this were a 2x, you still would not be able to cancel them because you have adding and subtracting. Now, if you're able to factor and then cancel things out, yes, that would work, but there's nothing to factor. So this is your answer. But if you just write that, you only get half credit because you need to state also the value that x cannot be. Okay? So we need to put, but x cannot be what? Anybody know?
-3.
Okay, now let me actually, I know we've been doing this visually, but let me actually demonstrate what I'm talking about here. We don't want this denominator to be 0, right? Now, if it were just x plus 3, yeah, we know that -3 would mess it up, but it's not just x plus 3, it's 2 times x plus 3. So the best way to figure out what would make this all 0 is to actually rewrite it on the side and set it equal to 0. And then that way you'll find out the value of x that'll actually make that whole thing 0. All right, so if I do solve this, I'd subtract 3. I'd end up with 2x equaling -3. I don't know why I canceled it out here, sorry. So that's 2x equals -3. Final step would be to divide by 2, divide by 2. So x cannot be -3/2. So x cannot be -3/2. So that's part of your answer as well. You have your answer, and you also have the value that x cannot be. And again, what is that value that x cannot be? It's the value that'll make this whole thing equal to 0. So if you set this whole thing equal to 0 and solve the equation, this will be the value that if you plug in will mess it up. Imagine me plugging in -3/2 right here. The 2's would cancel out. You'd have a -3 plus 3 left over, which would give you the 0 in the denominator. So there are another 2 type of questions you're going to see on the quiz for sure tomorrow. Let's see what else. We've added, we've subtracted, we've multiplied, we've divided. We're also going to plug one function into another function, right? Plug one function into another function. So again, we're using the same exact 3 functions, f of x in red, g of x in blue, and h of x in gray. So what does this notation tell us to do? To plug in the f function into the g function. So we're going to take this red one and plug it into the blue one, okay? So let me write my blue one first, my g function first. My g function is going to be 2x plus 3. And what am I going to put in those parentheses? The f of x function. And what is the f of x function? X minus 2. And after that, you just distribute, right? 2 times x, 2x, 2 times -2, -4. Bring down the plus 3. Combine the -4 and the 3. You simplify the whole thing. 2x minus 1 is your final answer right there. So g of f of x equals 2x minus 1. Now the other one's a little bit more challenging. What are we going to plug in where? We're going to plug in what? The g into the h. So what is the g function?
2x plus 3.
The blue 2x plus 3. And where are we going to plug that into?
X minus 2. X squared.
Into the h, which is x squared, right? Okay, so again, you just said we're plugging in the g into the h. So we're going to plug in that blue 2x plus 3 into the gray h, which is a x squared. So let's start by rewriting the h function, which is really x squared, right? That's the h function. It's just parentheses squared. Now, what goes inside of the parentheses? We're plugging in the blue g of x function, which is 2x plus 3. Now, how do we do this math? How do we simplify it?
2x plus 3 multiplied by itself.
Yep, 2x plus 3 times itself, right? 2x plus 3 times 2x plus 3. Let's distribute 2x times 2x, 4x squared. 2x times 3, 6x. 3 times 2x, 6x. 3 times 3, 9. Combine the middle terms. You'll get 4x squared plus 12x plus 9. That is your final answer for h of g of x. So that's technically section 6.1. Now 6.2 was where we had what? What are they called? Starts with the I. Inverse functions, that's right. So just a little intro, or not a little intro, a little review. If I were to have plugged in the f into the g, and for some crazy reason I just get the answer x, then maybe the f and the g are inverse functions of each other, right? You'd have to check both ways. But anyway, let's move on to something to deal with inverses, because we didn't even start with inverse functions. We started with finding the inverse of coordinates. Oh, wait a minute. Before even doing the inverses, I'm sorry. Let's go back and let's actually plug in values, right? Numbers. Let's get some solid answers here. Same three functions, f, g, and h. One red, one blue, one gray. So could somebody quickly calculate the answer to number 7? I mean, you could do it in your head, maybe. What would you say the answer is?
-1.
Does everybody agree with -1? Yeah? Okay, how about this? Instead of just saying the answer, what am I supposed to do? What does this tell me to do? Plug this in where? Into the g of x function. So I'm going to plug in -2 right in here. Let me actually demonstrate that. You should show your work when you're doing this. So I'm going to plug in the -2 into that blue function g of x, and I will get -4 plus 3, which is -1. Good? Good, I hope. So we know we could conclude that g of -2 is really this answer, -1. So what we really have here is f of -1. So when I plug in -1 into the f of x function, what do I get? -3. And let me actually demonstrate that. X minus 2, we're plugging in that -1. So the final answer to f of g of -2 equals -3. So that's the final answer for number 7. Could we do number 8? Try it. Some of us are trying to do it in our heads. That's fine. Go ahead. It's a challenge. Try to do it in your head. But on the quiz, you got to show your work, though. Okay? So what's the answer to this one?
21.
21. Did anybody else get 21? 21, 21, 20. All right. So it looks like a lot of people got 21, which is correct. All right. So once again, you're plugging in the -3 into the h function. Here's the h function. It's simply x squared. So let me do that. Let me plug in the -3 right in there into the x squared, which is really -3 squared, which will give me the answer +9, right? So we know so far that h of -3 is really +9. Again, h of -3 is really +9. So I'm going to rewrite this as g of +9. And I need to work this out. We know that the g function's in blue, so that's really a 2 parenthesis plus 3. And we are plugging in that 9 that we just got. So right there, we do end up with 2 times 9, which is 18. 18 plus 3, which is 21. Anyway, now let's move on to inverse functions. Every single one of these types of questions you will see on the quiz tomorrow. Okay, I lied. We're not in inverse functions. We're taking it a step further. Let's make it super fun. Could you plug in the f into the g into the h? I say, what? Try it out. So what does this really say? You kind of like zoom in and you start with the f of x. What is f of x? X minus 2. And what are you going to do with that red x minus 2? Where are you going to plug it into? Into the g of x. Okay, so let's take the red x minus 2 and plug it into the blue g. So let's do that. The blue g is 2 parenthesis plus 3. And let's plug in that red x minus 2. So when we do that, we're going to end up distributing 2 times x, 2x, 2 times negative 2, negative 4, plus 3. That'll actually be 2x minus 1. So what we know so far is that g of f of x is really 2x minus 1. So my new problem is really h of 2x minus 1. So what am I doing? I'm plugging in this green binomial 2x minus 1 into the h function, which is in gray. The h function in gray is simply x squared. So I am plugging in that 2x minus 1 right in there, which would mean I'd have to write that binomial 2 times. 2x minus 1 times 2x minus 1. Then you distribute and combine like terms. 2 times 2 is 4. X times x is x squared. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2x. Negative 1 times 2 is another negative 2x. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. Combine like terms, you'll get your final answer. 4x squared minus 4x plus 1 is the final answer to this triple function being plugged into each other, right? F plugged into the g, getting that answer, plugging it into h. We never actually did one of those on the homework, but I like them, so I think I want to put one of those on the quiz. Finally, inverse. Yes, I'm going to give you this simple, ridiculously easy question. What is the inverse of this relation? What will your answer be? Negative 3, 7. 5, 2. 6, negative 4. Ta-da! Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Simple as popping a pimple in a dimple. That's gross. I am sorry. Yeah, it's like a free point, guys. If you miss this one, I will slap you. I'm just kidding. I can't do that. It's illegal. There's also going to be other inverse questions. Find the inverse of this one right here. Y equals 5x minus 2. On this one, we're not finding the inverse of actual coordinates. We're finding the inverse of an actual function, right? Now, it doesn't matter if they call it f of x, g of x, or h of x. I want you to make it look like this. Make it look like a y, right? And how do we find the inverse of a function? Switching the x and the y, and then solving for y. Okay, so you got to know that. Switch the x and y, solve for y. So everybody, you could draw some arrows with the x and the y and put switch. That way you're going to have x equals 5y minus 2. And the second part, after switching the x and the y, you need to solve for y. Y is clearly on the right side of this equal sign. Maybe I should have put that in black, the equal sign. There you go. So I need to get this y by itself. I don't want the 5, I don't want the minus 2. Which one do I get rid of first? The 2, plus 2 to both sides. Can't really add x plus 2. Let's rewrite it. You're going to have x plus 2 equals 5y. What's my final step? Divide by 5 on both sides. So my inverse function is really y equals x plus 2 over 5. And you know what? It's probably better to write the inverse notation. Instead of just y, I guess I didn't have to erase it. Let's write down y with the little negative 1 power. Now, I'm not saying y to the negative 1 power. This is the notation for the inverse function of y. And you know what? I don't even like this. I don't even know if I've seen y to the negative 1. But if this would have started out with f of x, you would switch it to y, and then you would say f to the negative 1 power of x. But anyway, this is your inverse function right there. Whether you put f to the negative 1 of x equals, or whether you put y equals, whatever, that's the inverse function right there.
Would you not just split it like x over 5 and 2?
Good point. On a multiple choice test, they might not write it exactly like this. They might actually split the denominator of 5. Now, I'll accept like that tomorrow. Or if you split it, I'll accept it also. But if you split that denominator of 5, this 5, you could put it here and there with the plus sign right in the middle. The first one, there's an invisible 1 in front of x, so you'd have a 1 with the x right there. And the second one is obviously a 2 up there. So you could have written the inverse function like this and read y equals 1/5 x plus 2/5. Now, There will be a question where I ask you to graph the inverse of that function. So simply graph this one first and then just get some coordinates and switch the x and the y values of the coordinates and you'll have your inverse graphed right there. So it's as simple as that. If I ask you to graph the inverse, graph this one first. It crosses at -2. You go up 5/1, get those coordinates, identify the coordinates, switch the x and the y values, and you'll have the graph of the inverse of the function. And the last part of the quiz, are these inverse functions? How could we find out if these are inverse functions?
To plug in the equation to the other one?
Yeah, plug in one equation into the other one. So you're going to go f of g of x, and you're also going to go backwards g of f of x. Okay? So when you plug them in, you need to get the answer x on both of them. If you don't get the answer x on both of them, you could just stop what you're doing and say, no, they are not inverse functions. So let's try the first one, f of g of x. And it doesn't matter which one you do first. It has to equal x on both of them. So let's go with this first one up here, f of g of x. So I'm going to take my g function that's in blue and plug it into my f of x function, which is in red. So here's my f of x function, 5x minus 5. And like I said, I'm plugging in my blue g of x function right in there. So my blue g of x function is 1/5 x minus 1. And now I need to simplify it and see if everything cancels out except for a positive x. So when I distribute 5 times 1/5, that 5 and 1/5 cancel out. You end up with just an x. When you distribute 5 times -1, you'd end up with -5, correct? And when you have the -5 over here, does it cancel out? No. So right here, the answer is actually x minus 10. So it didn't give me just x. You would just stop right there and say, no, these are not inverse functions. Okay. But let's say it did equal x. You would also have to verify over here by plugging the red one into the blue one and seeing if it works, right? So it has to work for both. It has to equal x on both. Right here, because we also have a minus 10, those are not inverse functions. This thing messes it up. You want just x, you don't want that minus 10, so that's why no, they're not inverses. And that's about it. Okay, that's the whole quiz right there. I went through every single question on the quiz pretty much. Where am I going to get the questions from? The actual questions from? Homework, right? And maybe not all of them, but most of them come straight from the homework. So right now, I recommend finishing up your homework if you haven't done so already. Study the homework, watch this video again. You should be ready for the quiz tomorrow.